Hey everyone, it's Faultbox. Welcome back to my channel. Today is the final video in my Sylvie cosplay tutorial series where I'm going to be showing you all how I made the top, the pants, and the gloves for my Sylvie cosplay. So without any further ado, let's get on to the tutorial. For the gloves, the base gloves that were used on the show are these Dakeen EVO motocross gloves that are unfortunately kind of hard to find now because, well, when everyone found out that they were the base gloves, people went kind of crazy and bought them up. But I'll link them down below for you in the chance that you can find them on eBay or other warehouse sale websites. I also used a pair from Amazon earlier on that worked out really well, and we'll link those down below as another option for you. Modifying these gloves is pretty easy. I'm just going in with a pair of fabric scissors and cutting the tips of the gloves off a bit past the knuckle, and for the pinky and ring finger, I'm just cutting along the diagonal seam. I then went in with some fray check along where I cut and let that dry, and if you need any help keeping your fingertips open while they're drying, you can shove some paintbrushes and some markers in there to keep them open. Getting rid of that Dakeen logo is actually pretty simple because whatever glue they use to apply this is pretty terrible. I just took my heat gun and gave it a few passes over top the rubber and the logo peeled right off. Just be careful not to get too close with your heat gun or else you might risk burning the fabric. And the gloves were complete. Next up, it was time for the pants. And Sylvie's pants have this weird flap thing going on in the front. And from my limited research, they are based on a type of Thai fisherman's pants. So if you were into making your own from scratch, that's the type of pattern that I would be on the lookout for. But for my own pants, I decided to make things easier on myself and ordered a pair of baggy-ish pants from Amazon to modify. I'll make sure to link those down below for you. To get a pattern for the front flap, I just put my pants on and made a duct tape pattern directly on the pants. I go over how to do this in my duct tape patterning video linked below, but after a few minutes of laying duct tape down and drawing in a rough shape with my Sharpie, it's looking like that weird pant flap thing that I want, and so I take it off and place it down onto a piece of brown craft paper so that the pattern has a backing to it. I'm using a black performance stretch fabric that's similar to the pants to create this flap. I fold this fabric over twice and place my pattern piece as well as some pattern weights on top. You could trace your pattern out onto the fabric, but I didn't have any chalk, and to be honest, whenever I'm doing this on performance fabric, it doesn't really go well. So I just went rogue and cut my pattern out, leaving about 3/4 of an inch for seam allowance along all of the sides. Once I've got my two pieces of fabric cut out, I flip the pieces over so that the wrong side of the fabric is facing up, and I begin to pin the two pieces together all around the fabric, leaving a small gap of about 4 inches that will leave unsewn to flip things inside out later. Once everything's pinned, I take my piece to my sewing machine and I sew all of my edges with a stretch stitch. Make sure that when you're sewing stretch fabrics like this that you have a stretch needle installed on your machine, and if you're having a little bit of trouble feeding this fabric into your machine, you can use something like a walking foot or a Teflon foot, and these can make things a little bit easier for yourself. I sew all around the sides and make sure to leave that small gap of around 4 inches unsewn on the last side so that I can then go in and flip things right side out. I then sew that gap closed, and I've got myself my very own flap ready for some Sylvie pants. Installing this flap was pretty simple. All I did was cut down the outside seams of the pants, flipped everything inside out, and pinned the flap inside the outer leg seams. I then sewed along the pinned seams and flipped everything right side out, and I had me a pair of baggy flat pants to destroy a multiverse in. And last but not least is the top. I decided to make my arm sleeves removable instead of attaching them directly to the top, kind of for breathability's sake and the ability of being able to take them off if I was hot or eating and things like that. But you can totally follow these next steps if you want to have an all-in-one top. You'll just obviously need to sew your sleeves onto your top whenever you're finished. I do want to note here that if you're looking to make this for Halloween, or even if you're just making it for a convention in general and you don't want to go through the mess of making this top, you can 100% just wear something like a faux leather crop top and then put a cotton short sleeve top over top, and you're going to get a very similar effect to what I'm doing here. I did this for a few of my original cosplay tests before I even had started working on this cosplay, and it worked out perfectly fine and was just as fun. But anyways, enough rambling, let's get on to how I actually made this top. To start, I bought a cotton turtleneck and a faux leather crop top that I was hoping to MacGyver together, but I ended up not liking how thin of a material the crop top was, so I ended up using it to pattern out the sleeve details. You can do this with duct tape, but I had already cut my crop top apart and decided to put it to use in this way. I cut the sleeves off and made them into a sort of arm sleeve and drew on the circular details with a Sharpie. Once I was happy with how things were looking, I cut down the seam and laid my pattern flat onto some Yaya Han Ultra Preme fabric that I also used to cover the chest piece with. I laid my fabric down so that it was folded underneath itself, and this ensured that when I cut everything out, I would have two pieces of fabric in the same pattern. There's this really cool detail on Sylvie's sleeves that looks like 3 circles and a line going to the wrist, and my idea to get this on my own sleeves was to make the detail out of some thin EVA foam and sandwich it in between 2 layers of fabric with contact cement. To do this, I made the detail out of some 2mm EVA foam and patterned it out with my original sleeve pattern as a guide and used some washers I had lying around, as well as just doing a little bit of freehand work. Once it looked kind of how I wanted it, I cut everything out with an X-Acto knife and repeated all of these steps for the other sleeve detail. detail. I took my sleeve pieces and placed them together with the wrong side facing up on both sides and sewed along one side so that I could glue my foam piece inside of it. I did this to keep everything in place as I glued, but you can totally just pin your pieces together as well. But before you glue anything in, I would make sure that the arm sleeve fits you correctly, because when you glue in this detail, it's going to be a bit harder to tailor any further. You can sew everything up with a straight stitch, or you can even flip everything inside out while it's pinned to kind of double check the fit on your arm. I flipped open my sleeve as best as I could and layered on 2 layers of contact cement to both sides of the fabric, doing the same with the bottom and top of my foam detail piece. I let everything get tacky to the touch and then carefully placed my detail piece down inside, smoothing it out as best as I could. Once that was in place, I carefully laid the top layer of fabric on top of the detail, smoothing that down along the inside of the circles first, and then taking the end of a paintbrush to bring out the rest of the details. This took a bit of finagling and some time to bring everything out how I wanted, but after a couple minutes, this is how it looks, and it looks exactly how I wanted it to. I decided to paint my detail pieces with the same olive green leather paint as my chest piece, and doing it this stage when everything is flat is probably for the best, but I ended up painting mine a little bit later on in the process, but just paint it now while everything is flat. Now all that's left to do is to sew up all of the sides and hem the top and bottom of the sleeve. I fold over a bit of the fabric on the wrist and sewed everything down with a straight stitch to hem it, and along the top of the sleeve I took some gold piping and sewed all this down with a stretch stitch, and everything is basically finished. Adding on the collar to this shirt actually ended up being the biggest hurdle of the costume for me, and it was entirely my fault. Like I had mentioned earlier, I was using a crop top as well as a cotton turtleneck to kind of MacGyver together to get what I was looking for. And when I was cutting the original cotton turtleneck off of the piece, I cut below the seam line of the original collar and made the neck hole way too big, and I ended up having to go into my stash of costumes to find another turtleneck very quickly. I ended up finding this turtleneck from my Clone Wars Bo-Katan, and this time I cut the turtleneck collar above the seam line. Using the collar piece I had just cut off, I used this to pattern out my new collar in the same Yaya Han Ultra Premium fabric I used for the sleeves. Once everything was cut out, I pinned it to the inside of my shirt, sewed along the inside, and flipped everything right side out to reveal my shiny new collar. Now, another thing I found out about this fabric over the course of Dragon Con is that if you paint anything onto it and you stretch it, it will flake off. I painted on the gold trim along the top of the collar, and because I decided to make my top without a zipper, every time I took the shirt on and off, some of the paint would flake off to the point where it is no longer there. I would recommend sewing on a strip of gold to the top instead of painting it on. Yaya Han has a gold ultra premium that would work really well for this, and I actually have some on hand and I don't know why I didn't use it. Anyways, I didn't want to use the piping for this because it wasn't stretchy enough for my needs, but if you are going to install a zipper, it probably would work out for you. And finally, all that's left to work on for this top are the shoulder pads and to add some Velcro to attach them with. But all I did was create a duct tape pattern on my own shoulders, then traced and cut those base pieces out of 2mm foam. I then took that same pattern and traced it onto some quilting batting and some more of that Yaya Han Ultra Premium fabric, leaving some fabric along the edges for seam allowance that we'll fold under later. To get the quilted look on top, I traced the original base pattern onto some parchment paper and began tracing out the pattern with a ballpoint pen and a ruler. Parchment paper is great for things like this because you can sew directly on top of it and rip the parchment paper off after you're done, creating a kind of one-time use pattern that you'll be able to directly sew on top of. Once I was finished with my parchment paper patterns, I clipped all of my layers together, starting with the 2mm foam on the bottom, then the quilting batting and fabric, and topped with my parchment paper pattern. I then went over to my sewing machine and sewed along all of my drawn out lines to create this neat quilted pattern on top. I repeated everything to create the second piece, and all that was left to do was to remove all of that parchment paper off to reveal our really cool quilted design, and then hot glue some Velcro onto the bottom of these pieces and sew some Velcro onto the shoulders to attach them with. I also added a little bit of Velcro to the edges of the shoulder pieces to Velcro onto the chest piece straps, and I just hot glued some Velcro onto the bottoms of the straps on the chest piece. And with that, everything is finally complete, and it is time to give it a suit up and see how everything looks together, and I am so happy with how this came out. I am so happy that I decided to make these arm sleeves removable because the Atlanta heat was, at times a little oppressive, and it was really great to just be able to take them off whenever I was eating or whenever I was just kind of like walking to and from the convention just to kind of get a little bit of a breather. Thank you guys so much for following along for this build. It was a lot of fun, and I am happy to finally be closing out this cosplay tutorial series for you. If you have any other questions regarding the tutorial or just anything in general, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys next time. Bye!